The woman who once wore the crown of an empire stood at the edge of a banquet hall, holding a wine jug like a weapon she was not allowed to use. Queen Selene Ravaryn had survived war, famine, and the kind of loneliness that carves a person hollow. But nothing prepared her for the slow death of being erased while still breathing. Tonight, Lady Morel would demand she kneel, and tonight, something inside Selene Ravaryn was done kneeling. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what this queen did next will change the way you think about power forever. If you're watching from your city tonight, drop it in the comments. And if this story hits you somewhere real, you know what to do. The jug was silver. It had been a wedding gift from Cedric himself, engraved with the twin wolves of House Ravaryn, locked in stride, equal, inseparable, unbroken. Now Selene carried it across the marble floor of the East Banquet Hall like a servant, her fingers wrapped around the neck of it the way they might wrap around a throat, and she did not look at anyone who looked at her. She had learned that much in 8 months. Do not meet their eyes. The pity was worse than the cruelty. The hall smelled of roasted boar and burning cedar and something sweet underneath it all. Morel's perfume, the one she had taken from Selene's own dressing chambers along with the gold-threaded shawl and the pearl earrings Cedric had brought back from the eastern coast. Lady Morel wore Selene's things the way a conqueror hangs enemy banners from a captured fort, to remind everyone what had been taken, to make the taking feel permanent. "You're slow tonight," said Hessa, one of Morel's personal maids, passing Selene with a tray of candied figs. She did not look up when she said it. None of them did anymore. "You did not look a ghost in the face." Selene said nothing. She moved to the far end of the table where Lord Halverson sat next to his wife, and she poured his wine without being asked. Halverson had once ridden 100 miles to beg her counsel on the grain crisis in the southern provinces. He had called her the wisdom of the empire at a feast in her honor. Now he studied the candle flame while she refilled his cup and said quietly to his wife, "Morel's gown tonight is exceptional." The wife agreed. The wine poured. Selene moved on. 8 months. She had counted them by the bruises at first. Morel did not strike her. The woman was too clever for that. But she had a talent for arranging humiliations that left marks you could not show anyone. The day she made Selene carry her bathwater up 3 flights of stairs and then declared the temperature wrong and made her carry it back down. The morning she handed Selene a broom and asked her to sweep the main corridor before the ambassadors from the Veldris coast arrived. The night she hosted a private supper and sat Selene in the corner, visible to every guest, and called her "my little attendant" twice before Selene understood she was meant to stay standing throughout the meal. Then Selene stopped counting bruises. She started counting something else. The hall filled. 200 nobles, perhaps more. The cream of Cedric's shrunken court, the ones who had survived his moods and Morel's maneuvering, and the slow collapse of everything the empire had once stood for. They wore their finest tonight, silks from the southern trade routes, jewels from the mines that Cedric had seized when he abolished the eastern mining charters 4 years back. Every glittering thing in this room had been paid for by someone who was not in this room. Selene refilled wine and watched. She had always been good at watching. It was the first thing her mother had taught her. Not how to rule, not how to speak to a crowd, but how to stand still in a room full of motion and see what everyone else was too busy performing to notice. Her mother, the Duchess of the Ravaryn Highlands, a woman who had outlasted 3 kings and 2 wars and a plague that took half the northern coast, had sat young Selene down in the great hall of their ancestral keep and said, "The ones with real power are never the loudest ones in the room, Selene. They're the ones who know where the doors are." Selene knew where every door in this palace was. She had made it her business to know in the first weeks after Cedric stripped her authority, when she still half believed it was temporary, some cruelty brought on by grief or battle wound or the poison that war pours into the minds of men who stay too long at the front. She had walked every corridor. She had mapped every servant's passage. She had memorized the guards' rotation, not because she planned anything then, only because it gave her something to do with her hands when they shook at night. Knowledge, she had discovered, was the only possession no one could confiscate. Cedric entered the hall from the north archway, and the room rose. She did not rise. She was not permitted to sit at the table, so there was nothing to rise from. She stood near the sideboard and watched him walk the length of the hall, and she let herself look at him the way she had not allowed herself to look in months, directly, without flinching, cataloging the damage. He had aged. That was the first thing. Not in the way men aged from years, but in the way men aged from choices. The lines carved not by time, but by the specific weight of what they had become. His jaw was harder. His shoulders carried the permanent tension of a man who slept with one eye open. The brown of his hair had gone gray at the temples in a way that on another man might have looked distinguished. On Cedric, it looked like rust. He had been beautiful once. She did not let herself forget that because forgetting it would make what happened easier to understand, and she did not want it to be easy to understand. She wanted to carry the full weight of the absurdity of it, that this man, who had once held her face in his hands in a burned-out village north of the Veldris Pass and told her she was the reason he still understood what he was fighting for, had come home from that same war and handed her to his mistress like a piece of furniture he no longer wanted in the main room. She wanted to carry the weight of that because weight was not the same as defeat. Cedric reached his chair. Lady Morel was already seated beside him, in the place that had once been Selene's. The chair with the carved falcon's wings on its back. The one Selene had chosen herself when they were redesigning the hall 12 years ago. Morel sat in it like she had been born there. She was wearing sapphires tonight. She had never owned sapphires in her life before Cedric. "You're staring," said a low voice beside Selene. She turned. Torvon, one of the junior footmen, a boy of maybe 17, stood close enough to speak without being overheard. He kept his eyes forward, his posture correct, his face a mask. He had worked in the palace since he was 12. He knew how walls listened. "Am I?" Selene said. At him. "You do it sometimes when you think no one's watching." A pause. "People notice." "Let them." Torvon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lady Morel notices." Selene looked back at the table. Morel was laughing at something Cedric had said, her hand resting on the back of his where it lay flat on the tablecloth. It was a practiced gesture. Everything Morel did was practiced. Selene had spent 8 months studying that too. The way the woman moved through a room like she was always performing for an audience she had selected, the way her laughter came exactly a half beat after the punchline, the way she touched Cedric only when others could see it. "Let Morel notice," Selene said, and moved to refill another cup. The dinner proceeded. Selene moved. She poured, she carried, she stood when she was not moving, and while she did all of it, she listened with the focused patience of someone who had learned that silence in the right place was not submission, it was collection. She collected voices and fragments and half-finished sentences the way another woman might collect letters. She stored them somewhere behind her eyes where no one could search. Lord Vastin of the Eastern District, speaking to his secretary. "The grain tax again, 3rd quarter in a row. My people can't—" General Morkoff's wife, to the woman beside her. "Aldrich's regiment was disbanded. All of them. Morkoff says it's because they refused to swear the new oath to her." 2 young lords at the far end of the table, voices barely above a murmur. "My father says Halverson's ready to move if anyone gives him a signal, but no one's going to." No one's going to. That phrase lived inside her chest like an ember, because it had been true for a long time. No one was going to move, not because the grievances were insufficient, not because the people lacked the will, but because no one had anything to move toward. Resistance without a center was just riot. Revolution without a spine was just ruin. She had learned that from Cedric himself. In the years when they had campaigned together and she had sat in on his war councils, and watched him weld a broken alliance into a fighting force through the sheer force of his conviction that they were fighting for something real. She had watched him do it, she had studied how it was done, and she had spent the last 8 months doing it herself, quietly, in the spaces between servitude and sleep, building something invisible out of every conversation she was not supposed to be close enough to hear. After the 3rd course, Morel summoned her, not by name. Morel never used her name in public. She snapped her fingers twice, the sound cutting through the table conversation with the practiced casualness of a woman who had made sure everyone would hear it, and she held up her goblet without looking in Selene's direction. The room noticed. Rooms always noticed Morel's performances of Selene's diminishment. It was the point. Selene crossed the floor. She carried the jug. She poured. "Slower," Morel said, still not looking at her. "You're going to spill." She had not been going to spill. Her hands were perfectly steady. They had been perfectly steady for months because she had decided on the night of the first humiliation, in the dark of the small room she now occupied in the servants' wing, that she would not give them shaking hands to point at. She would not give them red eyes or a trembling lip or the specific performance of a woman breaking. She would give them nothing they could use. She poured slower. "Better," Morel said. And then, to Cedric, in the bright, easy voice she used when she wanted him to look at her, "Did you know she used to refuse to pour her own wine? She had girls for that. 3 of them, just for wine." The table laughed. Some of them laughed because they thought it was funny. Some of them laughed because Morel was watching to see who laughed. You learn to distinguish the two after a while. Cedric did not laugh. He looked at his plate. Selene filed that away too. She stepped back. She returned to the sideboard. She let the noise of the room wash over her, and she thought about General Morkov. Morkov had served under Cedric for 15 years. He had been at the Battle of Caravan, the engagement that turned the Northern Campaign, and Cedric had clasped his shoulder afterward and called him the spine of the army in front of 500 men. In the years after the war, Morkov had stayed loyal even as the court shifted, even as Cedric became something harder and stranger than the man who had won those battles. But 3 weeks ago, Cedric had disbanded Morkov's regiment, 400 soldiers, the most experienced fighters left in the standing army, because they refused to swear an additional loyalty oath to Morel personally. Morkov had not spoken of it publicly. But 2 days ago, in the narrow passage near the East Kitchens, Selene had been carrying linens and Morkov had been walking toward the stables, and they had passed close enough that she had heard him breathe in sharply when he saw her. And she had said, without stopping, without looking at him, without altering her pace in any way that the 2 guards 20 paces behind her could have registered, "The old garrison on the Raveth Road. The door on the north side doesn't lock." She had kept walking. So had he. 3 days later, a sealed letter had appeared in the lining of her work apron. She had not seen who put it there. The apron hung on a peg outside the laundry room during her morning shifts, and someone had placed the letter there between the 5th and 7th hour, and she would never know which of the laundry women had agreed to carry it. The letter said only, "Tell me what you need." She had burned it over a candle stub in her room and scattered the ash in the chamber pot. But she had written back. Not immediately. First, she had spent 3 days sitting with the weight of what it meant. Someone reaching out, someone willing, someone who had enough left to lose that they were willing to risk losing it. She had learned not to move on need alone. Need was the thing that had killed most of the people who had tried to help her already. Her younger brother Emmerich had acted on need. He had come to the palace in the 3rd month, ridden through the night from the Ravaryn lowlands with 2 guards and a plan that amounted to walk out the gate with me tonight. He had not thought past the gate. He had not mapped the roads or arranged safe passage or considered what it would mean for their family if they were caught. He had just come because he could not stand it anymore, because he had heard what they were making her do, and the need to do something had overridden the knowledge of what something done wrong would cost. She had refused him in the corridor outside the linen room. She had told him to go home. She had kept her voice even the whole time, even though she wanted to press her face into his shoulder and scream. 2 weeks later, Cedric's men arrested him on charges of treason. He was in a prison camp 3 days' ride north of the capital. She received the information through a kitchen girl who had a cousin in the garrison guard, and she had locked the information in that place behind her eyes, and she had thought about it every single night since, and it had not weakened her. It had clarified her. Because Emmerich in a prison camp was still alive. Emmerich was a card on the table that had not been played yet. And Selene had learned something crucial in 8 months of serving wine to the people who had taken everything from her. The players who moved too fast were always the ones who lost. She was going to move when she was ready, not before. After the 5th course, Morel stood and moved toward the small raised dais at the east end of the hall where the king customarily made announcements. Cedric stayed seated. He did that sometimes now, stayed seated while Morel took the floor, as though he had handed that function off along with everything else. The room quieted. Morel was wearing her public face. It was different from her private face in ways that Selene suspected most people in the room were not equipped to identify. The muscles around the eyes relaxed precisely enough to seem warm. The smile pitched to the second row rather than the first. The posture calibrated between authority and approachability. She was very good at this face. She had been practicing it for years, probably long before anyone here had known her name. "The Empire has been through a season of difficulty," Morel began. She had a voice that carried without seeming to try. Another practiced thing. "And I know there are those among us who question whether we are emerging stronger or simply emerging changed." She paused. The room was very still. But strength is not the absence of pain. It is the ability to look at what we have endured and refuse to be defined by it. That refusal, that is the soul of this court. That is what we rebuild upon. Several lords nodded. Halverson, Selene noticed, did not. "Which is why," Morel continued, and the warmth in her voice sharpened almost imperceptibly at the edges, "I have asked His Majesty to formalize a new role within the court, a role of oversight, a role of, let us say, preservation of standards." She looked then at Selene, direct, unhurried, the way a hunter looks at something already caught. And who better to oversee the household standards of this court than someone who has had such long experience with them? The laughter started somewhere at the far table and spread. It was not the cruel laughter of open contempt. It was worse than that. It was the easy, comfortable laughter of people who had decided they did not have to feel bad about something, because someone with power had given them permission not to. Selene stood at the sideboard with the silver jug. She breathed. She thought about her mother, about the doors. She thought about Morkoff's letter and the 10 others like it, from different hands, stored in different places, each one a thread in something she had been weaving for 8 months in the dark. She thought about Vaston of the Eastern District and the grain tax and the fact that the people of 3 provinces had not stopped being angry simply because the court had decided to forget they existed. She thought about Aldrich's disbanded regiment, 400 experienced soldiers without a purpose and without a paycheck, currently scattered across the empire with nothing to do but wait for someone to give them a reason. She thought about all the things she knew that Morel did not know she knew. And she did not react. She smiled just slightly at the sideboard in the half-second when no one was watching, because the only thing more dangerous than a woman with nothing left to lose was a woman who had spent 8 months building something while everyone assumed she had nothing left. She carried the jug. She refilled the cups. She was exactly what they thought she was. And in her room that night, after the fire and the corridor torches had burned to low embers and the last footsteps had faded from the servants' passage, Selene sat at the narrow writing table she had positioned against the wall opposite the door, and she wrote 2 letters. The first was to General Morkoff. It outlined 3 things: a meeting location, a time, and a question. The question was, how many of Aldrich's regiment are within 2 days' ride of the capital? The second letter was to a woman named Dara, who had been a royal steward for 11 years before Morel had her dismissed on a manufactured charge of theft. Dara now ran a dye house in the lower city. She also, Selene had learned, still maintained correspondence with 17 members of the palace household staff. The letter to Dara said only, "It is time to count who is left." She sealed both letters and placed them in the split lining of the leather satchel she used for carrying mending. She did not sleep for several hours after that. She sat in the chair, and she looked at the narrow window, and she thought. She thought about the night Cedric had come home from the front. She had been in the courtyard when the column arrived, because she had ridden out 2 miles to meet him on the road, because she had waited 3 years for this man to come home, and she was not capable of waiting in a room. She remembered the way the dust rose from the column, the gray cloud of it against the afternoon sky. She remembered his horse, the black one with the white streaked nose he called Sable, and the way Cedric sat it, the slightly forward lean of a man who had spent years in the saddle and was not yet accustomed to being still. She had seen Morel that same day, only for a moment, a woman at the back of the column, riding in a covered cart with 2 other attendants, someone's lady-in-waiting, she had assumed. She had not looked twice. She had been looking at Cedric. He had been looking at her. And his face when their eyes met had been, she had spent months trying to correctly name what she had seen on his face in that moment. It was not cold. It was not indifferent. It was something more specific and in some ways harder to bear than either of those things. It was recognition, clear, immediate, the face of a man who saw her completely, followed in the same breath by something that looked almost like grief, as though he had already decided something she did not yet know about, as though he had already, somewhere on the long road home, made a choice, and seeing her face only confirmed the cost of it. She had ridden beside him into the city and smiled at the crowds, and she had not known yet what she was smiling in the face of. She knew now. She knew also that Cedric was not a stupid man. Brutal men often were not. The stupidity was elsewhere, not in the mind, but in the character, in the specific softness at the center of a man who had survived terrible things and come back needing to be the one who was never again at risk. Morel had found that softness with the accuracy of someone who had been looking for it. She had given him the thing that most powerful and frightened men wanted most. A woman who made the cruelty feel like decisiveness, who made the control feel like strength. There was no anger left in Selene for Cedric anymore. Anger required the possibility of surprise. What she felt instead was something colder and more functional, something her mother would have recognized. She rose from the chair before dawn. She dressed in the plain dark clothing of the household staff. She tucked the letters into the satchel. She braided her hair back the way she had every morning for 8 months, the way that kept it out of her face while she worked, the way that would never in her life have been her choice if choice had still been hers. She picked up the satchel, she moved toward the door, and then she stopped. Outside in the servants' corridor, there were footsteps. Not the random, single-rhythm footsteps of someone moving through the passage to their shift. Multiple sets. Moving with the coordinated pace of people who had been told where to go and when to stop. They stopped outside her door. The knock, when it came, was not a request. Selene stood in the center of her small room with the satchel in her hand and the 2 letters inside it, and she thought very quickly and very clearly, because there was no other way to think in a moment like this, about what she had and what she had not yet done, and how much of what she had built could survive the next 60 seconds. The knock came again, harder. "By order of Lady Morel," said the voice outside, "you are to come with us immediately." Selene set the satchel on the bed. Her hands were steady. They were always steady now. She thought about the letters. She thought about the garrison on the Raveth Road, and the north door that didn't lock, and the 17 members of the household staff, and the 400 disbanded soldiers scattered across the empire like seeds waiting for rain. She thought about her brother in a prison camp 3 days north. She crossed to the door and she opened it. 4 guards stood in the corridor. Behind them, in the narrow passage that was barely wide enough for 2 abreast, stood a woman Selene had not seen in months. Morel's chief lady-in-waiting, Chorus, a thin-faced woman with the precise bearing of someone who had spent a career delivering bad news without showing any feeling about it. "Lady Morel requires your presence," Chorus said, "at this hour." Immediately. Selene looked at the 4 guards, at the torchlight on the stone walls, at the length of the corridor in both directions. "Then I should not keep her waiting," she said. They walked her through the palace in the gray hour before dawn, through passages she had memorized, past doorways she had mapped, and she counted the turns and noted the guards and breathed and thought, and said nothing. Until they reached the door to Morel's private receiving room and Chorus opened it, and Selene stepped through and she saw what was on the table. The satchel. Her satchel. The one she had left on the bed less than 10 minutes ago. Sitting open on Morel's writing table with both letters beside it, already unsealed. Morel was seated across the room in a chair that had been positioned to face the door. She was smiling. "I've been waiting," Morel said, "for you to finally do something worth punishing you for." Selene looked at the letters on the table. She looked at Morel. She looked at the letters again. Then she sat down. She did not wait to be invited. She crossed the room to the chair opposite Morel's, and she sat in it, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. And she watched Morel process this, the refusal to stand, the refusal to perform the expected posture of a woman caught. And she watched the smile on Morel's face sharpen at the edges, the way a blade sharpens when it finds unexpected resistance. "You're not going to say anything?" Morel said. "You didn't bring me here to hear me say something?" Morel tilted her head. It was a gesture she used when she was recalibrating. Selene had cataloged it months ago. The slight rightward tilt, the eyes going a degree cooler while the mouth stayed soft. The face of a woman who had prepared for one kind of conversation and was now adjusting for another. "Who is Morkov meeting?" Morel asked. "I don't know what you mean." The letter asks him how many of Aldrich's regiment are within 2 days' ride of the capital. Morel lifted the page, not to read it. She had already read it, but to let Selene see her holding it. That's not a social inquiry, that's a head count. It's a letter that asks a question. Asking questions isn't treason. It is when you're asking them of men whose soldiers were disbanded for refusing to swear loyalty to this court. "To you," Selene said. "They refused to swear loyalty to you. That's different from the court." The room was quiet for a moment. The torches along the wall breathed in and out with the draft from under the door. Chorus stood near the back wall with the 4 guards, and none of them moved. Morel set the letter down. "I want the names," she said. "Everyone who has contacted you, everyone you've contacted, everyone who has done anything, carried a letter, passed a message, looked the other way in a corridor." She paused. "Give me the names and this ends quietly." "And if I don't?" "Your brother is in a camp 3 days north." Morel said it the way someone places a card on a table, without drama, without apology, with the specific flatness of a person who wants you to understand they are not threatening you. They are simply describing the shape of your situation. He's been cooperative. Cedric is inclined toward leniency. That inclination is not permanent. Selene breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. Slow, the way she had practiced in the months when panic had been a real threat and she had needed something to hold on to that was entirely her own. She thought about Emmerich, his face when she had turned him away in the corridor, the way he had looked at her. Not with accusation, not with hurt, but with the specific grief of someone who understood why you were doing the thing that was breaking both of you and could not stop you from doing it. She thought about what Morel had just said, that Emmerich had been cooperative. "What has he told you?" Selene said. It was not a question. "Enough to know you've been planning something longer than anyone assumed." Morel leaned forward slightly. "Which makes you more interesting than I thought, and more dangerous than Cedric is willing to admit. He still thinks this is grief. I know it isn't." She let that sit for a moment. "I'm offering you a way out of this room that doesn't end with you in a cell next to your brother. You're offering me the chance to destroy everyone who trusted me. I'm offering you survival." Selene looked at the woman across from her. She looked at her the way she had looked at very few things in her life, without any of the protective distance she usually maintained, without the layer of calculation that she kept between herself and whatever she was examining. She looked at Morel directly and she thought, "You are very good at this. Better than Cedric. Better, probably, than anyone in this court has recognized, because the court has been too busy watching you perform power to notice that you are also, at the same time, performing the performance." A woman who understood, at some deep and ruthless level, that the only way to survive in a world that would not hand you anything was to become indispensable to the people who controlled what was handed out. Selene understood that. She respected the architecture of it even now. She also understood something Morel had not yet realized she had revealed. "You found the satchel," Selene said. "Obviously." "In my room. After I left it." A pause, almost imperceptible. Chorus retrieved it. "Chorus was in my room before the guards came to my door." Selene kept her voice level. "Which means you searched my room before you brought me here. Which means you already had someone in there." She tilted her head just slightly. "How long has someone been in my room?" Morel's face did not change. That was information too. "Long enough," Morel said. "Then you know those are the only 2 letters. You know I sealed them tonight and hadn't sent them yet. You know that whatever you think I've been building, you found it at the moment before it moved." Selene unfolded her hands and rested them flat on her thighs. "Which means you don't actually have the names. You have 2 letters that ask questions and prove nothing except that I have questions." The silence this time was different, heavier. Chorus near the back wall had gone very still. Morel picked up the second letter, the one to Dara. "Tell me what you need," she read aloud. It is time to count who is left. She set it down. That's not nothing. It's 2 sentences to a woman who was wrongfully dismissed from her position. It doesn't name a conspiracy. It doesn't describe a plan. It doesn't... Selene stopped herself. She did not need to build the argument further. She was not in a court of law. She was in a room with a woman who did not need evidence to act, and building a legal case was not the point. The point was something else entirely. The point was that Morel had moved too soon. If she had found the satchel and waited until the letters were sent, waited until responses came back, waited until there was something in Selene's possession that connected her to Morkov's soldiers and Dara's network of household staff, she would have had everything she needed. Instead, she had moved the night the letters were written, in the dark hour before they could be delivered, which meant she was frightened of something she did not yet have proof of. Frightened women move too soon. Selene knew that from experience. "What do you want?" Morel said. The performance was still in place, the composure, the controlled temperature of her voice, but underneath it, just barely audible to someone who had spent 8 months listening to this woman perform, there was the sound of a person who had expected this conversation to go faster. "I want my brother released. That's not something You have more influence over Cedric's decisions than Cedric does. We both know that." Selene met her eyes. "I want Emmerich released. I want him returned to our family's lands, and I want those letters burned in front of me." Morel stared at her. "And in exchange? In exchange, I go back to my room. I carry your wine. I sweep your floors. I do not write any more letters." A pause. "For now." "For now," Morel repeated. "You can't give me what I actually want," Selene said. "And we both know that too, so we can negotiate what we can actually trade. Or you can throw me in a cell next to Emmerich and explain to the court why you imprisoned a woman for asking a general a question, and you can watch Halverson and Vastin and every lord who's been waiting to see which way the wind is blowing decide it's blowing away from you." Morel stood up. It was the first time she had moved from the chair, and the movement had energy behind it. Not the controlled energy of a woman in command, but the specific restlessness of a woman who needed to think on her feet and did not want to be seen doing it. She walked to the window. It was still dark outside, the gray hour pressing against the glass without breaking. "You know what your problem has always been," Morel said, her back to the room. "You think this is about who is smarter, who sees further, who has the better pieces on the board." She turned. "It isn't. It's about who is willing to do what the other person is not." "Then tell me what you're willing to do," Selene said, "so I know where the line is." Morel looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Get out." Selene stood. She did not reach for the letters. She looked at them once, lying on the table, and she left them there, because taking them back would have been a mistake. Because Morel holding those letters and choosing not to use them immediately would be its own kind of chain around Morel's wrist, the weight of a decision deferred. And she walked to the door. "Selene." She stopped. She did not turn around. "The next time I find something," Morel said, "I won't bring you here first." Selene opened the door and walked back through the servants' passage in the gray dark with 2 guards 4 paces behind her, and she breathed steadily and did not think about what had almost happened. She thought instead about what had happened, what Morel had chosen, what that choice meant. By the time she reached her room, she understood 2 things she had not understood before. The first, Morel was not going to release Emmerich. Not tonight, not as a gesture of good faith, not because Selene had asked. The offer of negotiation had been a probe, a way to measure what Selene valued most, to see if the brother was the lever that would move her. Selene had named him deliberately, and she had named him without intending to hold to the trade, because the trade was never real. What mattered was that now Morel knew Emmerich was a pressure point, and knowing that Morel knew, it changed how Selene could use him. The second, someone in this palace had been inside her room, not just tonight. Chorus had arrived with the satchel too quickly in the minutes between Selene leaving her room and the guards coming to her door, which meant someone was watching her space on an ongoing basis, which meant that whatever she had hidden, the careful mental architecture of the last 8 months, the physical absence of any written record she had been so disciplined about maintaining, had been inside an observed perimeter all along. She sat down on her bed in the dark. She did not light the candle. She ran through it, every object in the room, everything she had touched, stored, handled. The spare aprons hung on the peg. The worn copy of a court treatise on civil law she had requested from the library 6 months ago, which she read because it was the only reading material she was permitted, and which also contained, in its discussion of precedent and testimony and the powers of a crown witness, more useful practical information than anything else in the palace. The single letter she had received from her mother 3 months ago, formal and careful, and containing nothing that could be used against either of them. Nothing written. Nothing that connected her to anyone. Only the 2 letters from tonight, and those were in Morel's possession now. She was clean. But someone had been in this room. She thought about Torvon, the young footman who had warned her about staring at Cedric. She had read him as cautious loyalty, a boy who was afraid but not unkind. Now she set that reading aside and considered the other possibility, the one she had been too comfortable in her read of him to examine. She did not have the luxury of comfortable reads anymore. In the morning, she rose before the household bells. She dressed. She plaited her hair. She went to the kitchens and she began her assigned work for the day, carrying linens, setting out breakfast service for the East Wing, and she moved through the corridors the way she always moved, invisible, efficient, unremarkable. But she altered one thing. When she passed Torvon in the passage outside the linen room, she did not speak. She did not slow her pace. She did not signal anything. She watched his hands. He was carrying a covered tray toward the upper corridor. His hands, as he passed her, shifted slightly on the tray's handles. A micro-adjustment, a reflex. It was the adjustment of a person who had been about to do something and decided not to. She had been watching hands for 8 months. She knew the difference between the reflex of surprise and the reflex of decision. She kept walking. By the time she reached the East Wing, she had identified 3 possible explanations for what she had seen, ranked them by probability, and arrived at a course of action so quiet and so specific that it would take days to execute and leave no trace, even if it failed. Morel thought she had won something last night. She had. She had won the letters and the knowledge that Selene was building something, and the temporary paralysis of a plan interrupted at its earliest stage. These were real gains. Selene did not minimize them. But Morel had also, in the hour before dawn, shown Selene exactly how close she was watching. And a woman who shows you how close she is watching has also shown you the edges of her vision. At mid-morning, Selene was sent to Morel's dressing chamber to assist with the preparation for a council audience. She arrived to find Morel already half-dressed, Chorus working at her hair, 2 other women laying out gown options across the daybed. The room smelled of that perfume. It always did. Morel did not acknowledge her entry. Selene moved to the wardrobe and began organizing the accessories for the chosen gown. The sapphires again, it appeared, and a matching brooch she recognized as having belonged to one of Cedric's dead aunts. "The brooch wants cleaning," Selene said. Not asking, observing. Morel looked at her reflection in the mirror. "Then clean it." Selene took the brooch to the small side table with the cleaning cloth and the silver polish, and she worked on it slowly, and she listened, because in the dressing chamber Morel spoke to Chorus the way people spoke to the furniture, with the partial attention of someone who did not consider the room's other contents to be listening. "Did Halverson send his answer?" Morel asked. "Not yet," Chorus said. "He's stalling." "He can stall until after the council meeting. After that, his vote is irrelevant." A pause while Chorus adjusted a pin. "What about the general?" "Morkov?" "The letter." Morel's eyes moved in the mirror. A flicker, quickly controlled. "Has anyone else been near her since last night?" "Not that we saw." "Then he hasn't received anything, which means he doesn't know we found it." She nodded slightly to herself. "Good. Leave it. Let him wait for a letter that never comes and see what he does." Selene polished the brooch. Her face was perfectly still. Morel was going to watch Morkov. Let the silence from Selene's end make him anxious and visible. It was a sound strategy. It would have worked, probably, if Morkov were a man who panicked under silence. He wasn't. Selene had chosen Morkov precisely because he was the kind of man who had survived 30 years of campaigns by learning to wait without moving. He would receive no letter. and he would do nothing, because doing nothing in uncertainty was what kept soldiers alive. But Morel did not know that. And now Selene knew that Morel was watching him, which meant Selene knew exactly which direction not to move in for the next several weeks. She set the cleaned brooch on the table. "It's ready," she said. Morel looked at it in the mirror's reflection without turning around. "Bring it here." Selene crossed the room. She stood behind Morel's shoulder and held the brooch out, and for a moment their reflections occupied the same frame in the mirror. Morel seated, poised, the machinery of her authority fully assembled, and behind her Selene standing with an object in her outstretched hand. She looked at their reflections. She thought, "You have been afraid of the wrong thing this whole time." Morel took the brooch. Their fingers did not touch. And 3 days later, in the gray hour between the 4th and the 5th morning bell, a kitchen girl named Bessa, who had a cousin in the garrison on the Raveth Road, who had been carrying small things in small ways for 3 months without anyone asking her to do more than she was comfortable doing, delivered a single folded piece of paper to a man named Aldrich's former second-in-command, who had been working at a mill 6 miles from the capital since his regiment was disbanded. The paper did not go to Morkov. It did not go through any channel Morel was watching. It said, "Do not move. Do not write. Count your men. Wait for the season to turn." And then, tucked into the inner fold, so small it could have been a crease in the paper, "I am still here." Selene was carrying Morel's breakfast tray up the east stairs when she felt the shift. Not in the palace, not in anything she could point to, but in herself. The specific internal settling of a person who has moved from preparation to patience and knows the difference between them. She had been preparing for 8 months. She was done preparing. Now she was waiting. And the thing about waiting, the thing her mother had never quite said aloud but had lived in every careful year of her careful life, was that it was not passive. Waiting was not the absence of action. Waiting was the act of letting your enemy exhaust herself against a wall that was not there. She reached the top of the stairs. Ahead, from behind the closed door of Morel's receiving room, she heard voices. 2 of them. Morel's and a man's she recognized after a second as belonging to the court's record keeper, an older man named Pell, who had served in that position for 20 years and who Selene had always considered a non-entity. She stopped outside the door. The guard at the end of the corridor was looking the other way. She listened. "All of them," Morel was saying. "Every property record for House Ravaryn going back 30 years. I want it done before the next council session." Pell's voice, thin and careful. "My lady, those records are archived under royal seal. To access them requires either His Majesty's direct order or you'll have His Majesty's order by this afternoon. I'm telling you now so you have time to locate the files." A pause. "What specifically are we looking for?" "Anything that can be transferred," Morel said. "The Highland Keep, the lowland properties, the mineral rights in the Carveth passes. All of it. I want legal documentation of grounds for forfeiture." The blood in Selene's hands went cold. Not her. The properties. Emmerich's inheritance. If Morel established legal grounds for forfeiture of the Ravaryn holdings, Emmerich lost everything. His lands, his title, his ability to operate independently even if he was released. He would emerge from that prison camp into nothing, into dependence, into a version of the same trap Selene was in, except with fewer walls and more visible chains. She stood outside the door with the breakfast tray in her hands, and she breathed. She breathed through the cold in her hands and the specific, precise fury of understanding that Morel was not just trying to neutralize her, she was trying to eliminate the architecture of everything Selene came from, everything she could return to, every foundation that might support a rebuilt life. This was not containment. This was erasure, and it was going to happen before the next council session, which was 6 days away. Selene shifted the tray in her hands and knocked on the door and entered when Morel called, and she set the breakfast on the table, and she did not look at Pell, and she did not look at Morel, and she left the room with her face composed and her hands steady, and she walked back down the east stairs and through the servants' passage and past the laundry room, and she stopped in the narrow alcove beside the drying racks where no one was, and she pressed her back against the stone wall, and she looked at the ceiling. 6 days. She thought about everything that was not yet in place. The thread she had been planning to let grow for weeks, the contacts she had been cultivating slowly because slow was safe and she had believed she had time. She did not have time. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. She opened them. She pushed off the wall. She was done waiting. She had 6 days and no safe channels, and one name she had been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. Dara. Not the letter she had written. That was in Morel's possession now, burned or filed or held as evidence. It did not matter which. But Dara herself was still in the lower city, still running the dye house, still connected to 17 members of the palace household staff through years of shared work and shared grievance. Selene had never contacted her directly. She had been building toward it slowly, carefully, the way you build toward anything that matters, with patience, with indirection, with the understanding that the most valuable resources were the ones you had not yet spent. She no longer had the luxury of not spending them. The problem was getting a message out of the palace in the next 24 hours without using any channel Morel was watching. She thought about this while she changed the linens in the upper corridor guest chambers. She thought about it while she carried the used bedding to the laundry. She turned it over the way she turned over every problem. Not frantically, not with the urgent scrambling of a person running out of time, but with the methodical attention of someone who had learned that panic was a resource expenditure and she could not afford waste. The laundry women. She had been cautious about them for 3 months, since the night she had received Morkoff's letter through the lining of her apron and understood that at least one of them was willing to carry things. She had not pushed further. She had not identified which one. She had left it dormant because dormant meant preserved. She finished folding the used linens and she looked at the 5 women working the washboards and the drying lines. She looked at their hands, their posture, the way they occupied the room relative to each other. There was one, older, maybe 50, a broad-shouldered woman named Het, who had been in the palace laundry for what looked like the better part of 2 decades. She worked with the particular efficiency of someone who had stopped noticing what they were doing because they had done it too many times to need to notice. But twice in the past 8 months, Selene had watched Het pause in her work when Selene entered the room. Not obviously. Not in a way that performed awareness, just a slight shift of attention. The adjustment of a person who had decided to be useful if the moment came. Selene carried the linens to the sorting table nearest Het's station. She did not look at her. She sorted the linens. "The dye house in the merchant quarter," she said, barely above a murmur. "The woman who runs it. I need her to know that the archive records under royal seal are being pulled within 6 days. She'll understand." Het's hands did not stop moving. "And I need her to know that the North Gate Guard rotation changes at the 4th morning bell. 3rd shift takes the eastern post. The position near the grain merchant's alley is unwatched for 11 minutes. Still nothing. Linens moved, water dripped. Then, so quietly Selene almost missed it. She'll know by nightfall." Selene picked up the empty sorting basket and left the laundry. She spent the rest of the day in the mechanical performance of her assigned duties, and she did not think about what she had set in motion because thinking about it would not make it move faster, and it would make her face do things she could not afford her face to do. She carried trays. She aired Morel's sitting room cushions. She stood outside the door of the council antechamber for 2 hours while Cedric met with his remaining military advisors, waiting in case Morel required something brought up. And she stood there, and she listened to the muffled voices on the other side of the door, and she caught fragments, and she stored them. Cedric's voice raised, "I don't need to justify the decision to you, Halverson." Halverson, measured and flat. "I'm not asking for justification, Your Majesty. I'm asking what happens to the eastern grain supply when Vastin's people stop cooperating with the distribution routes." A long silence. Then Cedric again, lower, the anger compacted into something denser. "Handle it." She filed that away too. Halverson was still pushing, still present, still the man who had ridden 100 miles to ask her counsel and had not, despite 8 months of watching her pour wine, entirely forgotten what that counsel had been worth. That night she slept 4 hours. She woke before the bells. In the morning, Torvon was not at his usual post outside the upper corridor. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, without breaking stride, without letting the noticing show. and she adjusted her mental map of the palace staff accordingly, and she wondered, with the cold wondering that had replaced whatever warmer version of intuition she had once possessed, whether Torvald's absence was coincidence or consequence. She decided to assume consequence. She was carrying Morel's mid-morning refreshments up the west stair when she turned the landing and found Chorus waiting for her, not blocking the stair. Just standing at the landing, arms folded, the thin-faced composure of a woman who had been sent to deliver something and was choosing to deliver it here rather than in a more public location. "Lady Morel wants to see you," Chorus said. "I'm bringing her refreshments." "She knows." Selene looked at the tray. She looked at Chorus. She continued up the stairs. Morel was in her private receiving room again. The same chair, the same positioning relative to the door, but the room felt different this time. Less staged, less the deliberate arrangement of a woman in control. The fire was higher than it needed to be for the hour, and the window was unlatched, and Morel was standing rather than seated, which was also different, and something about the combined details of those small things sent a current through Selene's chest that she identified, before she fully understood why, as warning. She set the tray on the side table. "Torvald is not at his post," Selene said. "No," Morel agreed. "Is he unwell?" "He is being questioned." The room was very still. Outside the unlatched window, the city noise rose faintly. Cartwheels, distant voices, the ordinary sound of a world that did not know what was happening inside these walls. "About what?" Selene said. Morel looked at her directly. It was not the look she used in public. The calibrated warmth, the controlled performance of authority, made approachable. This was something more unmediated. A woman looking at a problem she had not fully solved and was not entirely certain she could. "He came to me," Morel said. "Last night. Voluntarily." The cold moved from Selene's hands to her sternum. "He told me about a conversation in the laundry room, about a woman named Dara in the merchant quarter, about the North Gate and the grain merchant's alley and 11 minutes. Morel tilted her head. "He said he was worried about you. He said he thought you were going to do something that would get you killed." Selene stood perfectly still. She ran through it. Every conversation she had ever had with Torvald, every moment of apparent warmth or apparent caution. The warning about staring at Cedric, the careful, understated manner of a boy who had grown up in this palace and learned how to be useful to whoever was ascending. She had read him as cautious loyalty. She had been reading the performance of loyalty. The real thing underneath it was something more practical and more familiar than loyalty. It was survival. And Torvald, who had grown up in this palace, who understood better than almost anyone how walls listened and how quickly the favored became the fallen, had made the calculation that every person in a court eventually made. He had bet on the power that was currently winning. She had been careful about his hands. She had not been careful enough about what was behind them. "What did you tell him?" she said. Her voice was steady. She did not know how it was steady. It simply was. "I told him he'd done the right thing." Morel's eyes did not waver. "He has a family in the lower districts, 2 younger sisters. I told him they would be taken care of." Selene breathed in, out. "So Het," she said, "was already working for me." "Yes." A pause that felt less like hesitation than like something being set down carefully. "She has been since the 3rd month, since you received the letter through her." The letter through the apron lining. The letter from Morkoff that Selene had burned over the candle stub. She had assumed the channel was clean because nothing had come of it. She had assumed the channel was clean because she had wanted it to be clean, because she had needed something to trust, and Het had been the closest thing she had to a natural ally in a room she spent significant time in. She had made an assumption based on need. She had told herself she did not do that anymore. The cold in her sternum spread outward. "The message to Dara," Selene said, "has been intercepted." "And Dara herself?" Morel was quiet for a moment. That specific quiet that meant the answer was being weighed, not withheld. "Dara is being brought in," Morel said, "for questioning." Something cracked in Selene's chest. Not loudly, not in a way that moved her face or changed her breathing or gave Morel anything to read, but it cracked. The specific fracture of a person who has built something with great care over great time, and is now watching it be disassembled with equal care by someone who knows exactly which joints to pull apart. 17 members of the household staff. Dara's network, built over 11 years, dismantled at the name, her name, the name Selene had put in a letter that Morel had been holding for 3 days. "You waited," Selene said. "I waited," Morel confirmed, "to see where you went when you were scared." Selene looked at her. She looked at the woman who had taken her chair in her rooms and her husband and her standing and was now, with the efficiency of a siege that had been planned before anyone admitted there was a war, taking the hidden thing. The invisible architecture. The carefully tended network of the frightened and the grieving and the wronged. She had built it in the dark. Morel had been watching the dark. "What do you want?" Selene said. "I want you to stop." Morel said it without drama, the flat delivery of someone stating an observable fact. "Not because I'm afraid of what you're building, because what you're building is going to get people killed who don't deserve to be killed." Dara, Het, who has 2 children. Morkov, who's too old for another round of someone else's war. She paused. "You are not going to win this, Selene. The only question is how many people you take down with you when you lose." Selene stood in the room with the high fire and the unlatched window, and she thought about her mother, about doors, about the specific wisdom of a woman who had outlasted 3 kings, not by fighting them. Her mother had never fought anyone directly in her life, but by understanding that the door you needed was not always the door in front of you. She thought about Emmerich, 3 days north in a camp, cooperative, which she now understood differently than she had understood it 2 days ago. Cooperative, meaning that he had told them what he knew, meaning that what he had told them had led Morel here, not to the letters alone, but to the understanding that Selene had been building something for months, meaning that Emmerich, in his prison camp trying to survive, had given them enough to start pulling threads. Her brother, who had ridden through the night to save her, had become the instrument of her unraveling. She did not blame him. She knew what camps did to people. She knew what the offer of leniency looked like from inside a cell to a man who had already lost everything he came to protect. She understood, with the specific grief of a person who had learned to convert grief into information, exactly how it had happened, and she understood something else. Morel had shown her all of it, named every dismantled piece, explained exactly how thoroughly the network had been mapped and cut. She had done this not to gloat. Morel was too controlled for gloating, but because showing Selene the completeness of the loss was the most efficient way to end the fight. You did not need to imprison a woman who believed there was nothing left to fight with. The belief was the cell. "How many of them are actually being questioned?" Selene said. "Truly, not just Dara. How many of the household staff has Morel been able to identify?" The question came out quieter than she intended. It came out of somewhere underneath the cold and the fracture, somewhere that had not yet fully absorbed the scale of what had happened and was still, with the reflexive stubbornness of something that did not know how to stop, looking for the thing that was not lost. Morel blinked, almost imperceptibly. I'm not asking rhetorically." Selene looked at her directly. "How many?" A silence, longer than any of the others. "Enough," Morel said. It was not a number. Enough was not a number. Enough was a word used by someone who did not want to admit the actual figure because the actual figure was smaller than what they had implied. Something shifted in the room. Selene stood at the center of it, and she felt the shift the way you felt a change in wind direction. Not with your eyes, not with your hands, but with the skin of your arms and the back of your neck, and some older, less articulate part of yourself that had been paying attention while the rest of you was occupied. Morel had Het. She had Torvon. She had intercepted one message, the one Selene had sent through a channel she had just burned. She had Dara being brought in, which meant Dara was not yet in custody, which meant the interrogation had not happened yet, which meant Dara did not yet know what had been revealed about her. The 17 names in Dara's network were not in Morel's hands. Not yet. "I'd like to go now," Selene said. Morel looked at her, the recalibration tilt of her head, barely there. "We're not finished." "I think we are," Selene said. "You've told me what you want me to know. I've heard it. There's nothing left to say in this room that isn't better said somewhere else. If you walk out of this room and continue what you've been doing, you'll do what?" Selene asked. Not with heat, with genuine, quiet curiosity. You've shown me the worst of what you can do. Emmerich is already imprisoned. The network you've named is already compromised in your telling of it. Dara is being brought in, which means she's not here yet. She let that settle. What exactly is the threat from this point forward? The fire crackled. Outside, the city went on being a city. Morel's face was very controlled and very still, and underneath the control and the stillness was something Selene had never seen on that face before in 8 months of close and careful observation. She was almost certain it was fear. Not the productive fear of a person who has identified a risk and is managing it. The other kind. The kind that moved in when the plan had been executed correctly and the target was supposed to be finished and the target was still standing and looking at you with clear eyes and asking what exactly you were going to do next. Chorus, Morel said. The door opened. The guards entered. And Selene understood that the conversation was over because Morel had run out of words that could accomplish what she needed accomplished. And when a woman like Morel ran out of words, she moved to the next available instrument. They took Selene's arms. Not roughly. 2 guards, professional, 1 on each side, the grip firm and impersonal. The grip of people doing a job. She did not fight it. Fighting it was not the move. She was walked back through the palace, not to her room in the servants' wing. Down. Down the east stair, past the lower corridor, past the old armory passage, to the part of the palace that had been a storage wing in the years when Cedric and Selene had ruled together and had been converted, sometime in the last 2 years, into something else. The door they stopped at was iron. Heavy, new iron, recently fitted. The corridor smelled of damp stone and disuse, and the particular cold that lived underground. One of the guards unlocked the door. The other kept his hand on her arm. And in the moment before they put her through it, in the 2 seconds between the door swinging open and the forward movement that would take her through it, Selene looked down the length of the underground corridor, and she saw, in the dim light of the torches spaced far apart along the walls, 3 other doors. 3. One of them, she understood in the way that understanding sometimes arrived as a physical sensation rather than a thought, contained her brother. She crossed the threshold. The door closed behind her. She stood in the dark of a stone room with a narrow window slit near the ceiling that showed a strip of morning sky, and she pressed her back against the wall, and she looked at that strip of sky. And she did not let herself think about Emmerich in the room down the corridor, because if she thought about that, she would not be able to think about anything else. She had been outplayed, completely, systematically, and at almost every level. The informant she trusted had been turned. The channel she used in desperation had been watched. The network she had spent months building had been mapped by someone with more patience and more reach than she had accounted for. She had been careful. She had been more careful than she had ever been in her life. And she was in a cell. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the stone floor, and she looked at the strip of sky, and she thought, not frantically, not with the spiraling horror of someone in freefall, but with the stripped-down clarity of a person who has lost everything that was cushioning them from the actual shape of their situation. What did she have? Not what she had built, not what she had planned. What she had right now, in this room, that was real and present, and could not be taken by anyone who had not already taken it. Her mind. Everything stored in it. Names, rotations, conversations overheard in corridors and dressing rooms and antechambers. The knowledge of where every door in this palace was. The knowledge of what Morel had not done. She had not told Cedric about any of this. Selene was almost certain of it. Because if Cedric knew, if Cedric understood the scope of what Selene had been building, the response would not have been a cell in a converted storage wing. It would have been something louder, something public, something that served Cedric's need to be seen as decisive. Morel had been handling this privately, which meant she was managing Selene as her own problem rather than bringing her to Cedric as a shared one, which meant Cedric did not know, which meant there was still a space between them that nothing had filled yet. Selene pressed the back of her head against the cold stone wall. She had been playing the game she knew: patience, architecture, the long and careful accumulation of pieces moved through trusted channels. She had been playing it against a woman who had already mapped her channels before the game began. That game was over. She needed to stop playing the game she knew. She counted the hours by the light in the window slit. The strip of sky went from morning gray to midday white to the amber of late afternoon, and Selene sat on the stone floor, and she did not sleep, and she did not pace, and she did not do any of the things that fear pushed people toward when they were locked in small rooms. She sat and she thought, and the thinking was not desperate. It was architectural, the same patient construction she had been doing for 8 months, except now the building material was different, because almost everything she had accumulated was gone, and she was working with what remained. What remained was this. Morel had not told Cedric. She kept returning to that. Turned it over. Examined it from different angles, the way you examined a stone that might be a keystone or might be nothing, trying to determine which before you committed your weight to it. Morel's decision to handle Selene privately was not loyalty to Cedric. It was not protection of him from a difficult truth. It was the decision of a woman who understood, at the level where real understanding lived, that the moment Cedric knew Selene had been building resistance for 8 months, the moment he understood the scale of what had been happening under his roof while he was occupied with his war and his conquest and his new obsession, he would also have to confront the question of why. And the why, examined honestly, led directly back to Cedric, to the choices he had made, to the specific cruelty of stripping a woman of everything she had earned and making her serve the person who replaced her. Cedric could sustain the performance of Selene as defeated. He could not sustain the performance of her as a genuine threat without also acknowledging that threats were created by the conditions that produced them. Morel knew this. She had been managing Cedric's self-image for years with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much a powerful man's sense of himself was the actual governing force in the room. She would not disturb that self-image with the truth of what Selene had been doing, because the disturbance would create questions she could not control the answers to, which meant that if Selene could get to Cedric before Morel did, if she could be the one to name what had been happening in this palace, she controlled the frame. The problem was getting out of the cell. She examined that problem too. The door was iron, recently fitted, locked from the outside. The window slit was 6 inches wide. The corridor outside, as she had seen in the 2 seconds before the guards put her through the door, had 3 other occupied cells and a torch rotation she had not been in the space long enough to fully map. She had nothing on her person that could work a lock. She had her clothing, her braided hair, the specific knowledge stored behind her eyes, and the understanding that every system built by human beings contained the humans who built it. The guards who had brought her here were palace guards, not Morel's personal household, palace guards, which meant they served the crown, which meant their ultimate loyalty was not to Morel, but to the office of the king. Morel had borrowed them the way you borrowed a tool that belonged to someone else. Tools borrowed without the owner's knowledge could be returned. She was still working through the shape of this when she heard, from further down the corridor, her brother's voice. Not words. Sound. A sharp, involuntary sound, the kind a person made when something hurt them. Then silence. Then the distant sound of a door. She pressed her palms flat against the stone floor and breathed. She thought about Emmerich the last time she had seen him clearly. Not the corridor outside the linen room where she had sent him away, but before that. In the great hall of the Ravaryn Highlands keep, maybe 3 years before any of this, sitting across from her at the long table with their mother between them, arguing about the mill tax in the Eastern Holdings, his face animated, his hands moving the way they did when he was making a point he believed in. He had their father's jaw. He had their mother's eyes. He had the specific vitality of a person who had not yet learned to insulate themselves from what they cared about. She had sent him away from the palace because she could not afford him. She had been right. She had also been wrong in a way that she was only now, sitting on a stone floor 3 cells down from him, fully able to see. Not in her calculation, but in her failure to account for what the calculation would cost him. She filed the grief away. She would carry it later when she had somewhere to put it down. The strip of sky in the window slit went dark. Around the 8th hour of the night, the torch in the corridor guttered and went low, and Selene heard footsteps, one set, unhurried, the deliberate pace of someone doing rounds. One guard. Night rotation in a converted storage wing that Morel had not gotten around to staffing properly because she had not expected to be filling it. The footsteps stopped outside her door. Silence. Then, very low, barely audible through the iron, "Your Majesty." The title hit her like cold water, not because it was unexpected. She had retained the title technically. Cedric had stripped her authority, but not the formal address. A distinction that had felt meaningless for 8 months and now felt like a rope thrown into a hole. But because of the voice. Young, male, careful. A voice she recognized. Not Torvon. Someone else. Someone she had not mapped. "Who are you?" she said, at the same volume. "Aldrich's man," the voice said. "Bessa got word to us before they took her." Bessa, the kitchen girl, whose message Selene had believed intercepted. "How many of you?" she said. "Enough. Not enough to fight, enough to open a door." She stood up from the floor. Her legs had stiffened from hours of cold stone, and she felt the ache in her knees and her hips, and she did not favor it. She just stood through it, because the body's complaints were information, not instruction. "My brother," she said. A pause. "The cell at the end. He comes with me." Another pause, longer. "That complicates, he comes with me, or I stay in this cell," she said. "Decide." The silence on the other side of the door had the quality of someone making a fast calculation in a situation they had not fully planned for. Then the sound of a key. The door swung open. The guard, young, maybe 22, wearing palace colors but with the specific bearing of a man who had learned to stand in a formation, looked at her with the wide, careful eyes of someone who had committed to something and was only now fully feeling the weight of it. "The East Passage," he said. "It comes out behind the grain merchant's alley." "I know where it comes out." She moved past him into the corridor. "My brother first." They went to the end cell. The key, the same key, the lock. The door opened and Emmerich was on his feet before it finished swinging, standing, which told her something, and blinking at the torchlight with eyes that took a second to adjust, which told her something else about how long he had been in the dark. He looked at her. She looked at him. His face did what faces did when they had been holding something back for a long time, and then the thing they were holding it back from arrived. He opened his mouth. "Not now," she said. "Not hard, not cold, just the truth of the moment." "Walk." He walked. They moved through the underground passage with the guard ahead of them, and Selene counting turns in the dark, mapping the route against her mental architecture of the palace's lower levels, and she felt the cold stone air give way gradually to something different, damper, carrying the smell of the city, of animal and coal smoke and bread and human density. And then the passage ended at a wooden door, and beyond it was the narrow alley behind the grain merchant's warehouse and the night sky, massive and indifferent above the capital's roofline. She stopped in the mouth of the alley, and she breathed the night air, and she looked at the strip of sky above the buildings, and she made a decision. Not the slow, architectural decision of a woman with time. The fast, committed decision of a woman who understood that the only advantage she had left was that Morel did not yet know the cell was empty. "I need to get back in," she said. The guard stared at her. "You just—" "Not through the underground passage, the west entrance, the servant's door on the third courtyard." She turned to Emmerich. "You go with him. Do not come back. Do not try to come back. Get to the Ravaryn lowlands and tell our mother that the archive records are being pulled and she needs to secure the mineral rights documentation through an independent charter before the council session in 6 days." She held his eyes. "Can you do that?" Emmerich looked at her. In the alley light, in the shadows and the coal smoke smell of the lower city, his face did the thing it had done in the corridor of the palace 8 months ago. The specific grief of someone who understood why you were doing the thing that was breaking both of you. "Selene," he said. "Can you do that?" A long breath. "Yes." "Then go." She looked at the guard. "Keep him moving until you're past the 3rd district marker. After that he can ride. There are horses at the Raveth garrison who owe the Ravaryn name a debt." She did not wait for confirmation. She turned back toward the palace. Emmerich's hand caught her arm. She stopped. "What are you going to do?" he said. She looked at the palace wall above the alley, at the lit windows of the upper floors, the movement of shadows behind glass, the ordinary machinery of power operating on the assumption that its prisoners were still contained. "What I should have done 8 months ago," she said. "I'm going to talk to my husband." She pulled her arm free. She went back through the wooden door. The West servants' entrance on the third courtyard was unwatched at this hour. She had known that for 6 months, had mapped it in the first weeks when mapping was the only thing she could do. She moved through it and up the back stair and into the palace's interior with the specific invisibility of a woman who had spent 8 months training this building to ignore her. She needed to reach Cedric before Morel's night check found the cells empty. She estimated she had 40 minutes, maybe less. She moved fast. Not running. Running in palace corridors drew attention even at this hour, but the fast, purposeful stride of household staff with a reason to be moving, which she had performed so many times it sat in her body like memory. She went up the main stair, past the portrait gallery, past the room that had once been her council chamber and was now being used, she had heard, for Morel's personal correspondence archives. Cedric's chambers were in the North Tower. He had moved there after the first year of the war, during a period when he claimed he needed the higher vantage for studying campaign maps, and he had never moved back. She had not been in those chambers in 3 years. 2 guards at the corridor entrance, palace guards, the same rotation she had spent months memorizing. She knew the one on the left, a man named Ravaryn, 15 years in the palace guard, who had been at Caravan, who had served under Morkov, who had been at the victory celebration when Cedric called Morkov the spine of the army. She did not know if Ravaryn remembered that night. She knew he had not been among the guards who took her arms and walked her to the cell, which meant he had not been chosen for whatever team Morel was using for personal operations. She walked to the corridor entrance and she stopped in front of Ravaryn, and she said, "I need to see the king." Ravaryn looked at her. His face went through something complicated. Surprise, recognition, the professional reflex that said protocol, followed immediately by the more human reflex that said, "This is not a usual situation, and protocol may not be the right instrument." "My lady," he said. The title. Not the maid's address, not the attending servant. The title. "This hour. I know the hour. I need 5 minutes with the king." She held Ravaryn's eyes. "You served under Morkov at Caravan. I know that because I was the one who approved Morkov's battlefield commission 6 weeks before that engagement." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I am asking you to let me through." The other guard looked at Ravaryn. Ravaryn looked at Selene. He stepped aside. She went through. She knocked on Cedric's door. Not tentatively. 3 knocks. Firm. The knock she had used on this door for 12 years when she had something to tell him that would not wait. Silence. Then movement. Then his voice, rough with interrupted sleep. "What?" "It's Selene," she said. The silence on the other side of that door had a different quality from every other silence in this story. It had the quality of something that had been waiting for a long time to be what it actually was. The door opened. He was wearing a plain shirt, unlaced. His hair was disordered. He was holding a lamp, and in its light he looked older than he had looked at the banquet table, older than he had looked in the council antechamber, older in a way that the formal performance of his authority had been covering and the sudden absence of that performance revealed. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well for a very long time. He looked at her. She looked at him. She thought about the moment in the courtyard when he came home from the war, the recognition on his face followed by grief. She understood it differently now. Not the grief of a man who had decided to discard her. The grief of a man who had already, on the long road home, been convinced by someone that he needed to, and who had seen her face and understood, in the same breath, what it was going to cost him. She had spent 8 months being angry at the decision. She had not until this moment thought carefully enough about the conviction. "You should invite me in," she said. "What I have to tell you cannot be said in a corridor." He stepped back. She entered. He set the lamp on the table. He did not sit. Neither did she. They stood in the center of the room in the lamplight, 2 people who had shared this kind of space for 12 years and were now standing in it like strangers reading the furniture of a life they used to know. "You're supposed to be confined," he said. "I was. I left." She watched his face process this. "Morel put me in a cell in the converted storage wing." She also imprisoned Emmerich. She did not tell you either of those things. The muscle in his jaw moved. Selene, I need you to listen to me, not as your attendant, not as the woman you reassigned, as the person who has been inside this court for 12 years and has spent the last 8 months watching what Morel is doing to it. She held his eyes. I have evidence. Not a letter, not a second-hand account. I have transcripts of conversations I overheard in rooms where I was considered furniture. I have the names of lords who are 2 steps from open defiance. I have the documentation to prove that the Eastern grain supply is failing and that 3 provinces are going to stop cooperating with the capital's distribution routes before winter. He was very still. And I have something else, she said. I have the letters. He looked at her. What letters? The ones Morel wrote to a man named Dovin in the Northern Territories. The ones she has been writing for 4 years. The ones that outline, in her handwriting, a very specific plan for what happens to this empire after you are no longer in a position to govern it. The blood left his face. She had not planned this for 8 months. She had not even known about the letters 4 months ago. She had found the first reference to them in a conversation she was not supposed to be close enough to hear, and she had spent the subsequent months locating what she could, building a picture from fragments. She did not have the letters physically, but she knew enough about their contents to describe them with a specificity that no one could have achieved through invention, and she knew, from the way Cedric's face had just moved, that the name Dovin was not new to him. Where did you... He stopped, started again. How do you know about Dovin? Because I have been paying attention for 8 months while everyone in this palace believed I had stopped being worth paying attention to. She did not say it with anger. She said it with the flat, clear delivery of an observable fact. Cedric, she is not managing your court. She is dismantling it, and she has been doing it long enough that some of the damage cannot be undone. He turned away from her. He walked to the window. He put his hand on the frame and he looked out at the capital, at the lit streets and the dark buildings, and the enormous sleeping mass of a city that had been built by the institution he now headed. And she could see his shoulders from behind, and she could see what was in them. Not the rigid tension of a man in control, but the forward collapse of a man holding something very heavy and losing his grip on it. She had seen that posture before. She had seen it the night before Caravan, when the casualty reports came in from the forward positions, and he had stood at the map table with his back to the room. I need to see the proof, he said. His voice was rough, not with sleep anymore. I need something first, she said. He turned back to look at her. Morkov, his regiment restored, not quietly, publicly, at council. She held his gaze. And the forfeiture proceedings on the Ravaryn holdings stopped before the archive records are pulled. He studied her. He had always been good at reading people and bad at admitting what he read. You've been building something, he said. Yes. For how long? Since the 2nd month. Something moved through his face. She catalogued it without letting herself feel it, because feeling it required a kind of softness she had not been able to afford for a very long time, and she was not certain she could afford it yet. It was not guilt, exactly. It was recognition. The same recognition she had seen in the courtyard when he came home, but stripped of the grief now, stripped of the performed certainty of a man who had made a decision. What was left underneath was something rawer and more honest than anything she had seen on his face in years. Selene, he said. Don't, she said. Not yet. I need your answer first. He looked at her for a long moment. Then somewhere below them, in the depths of the palace, an alarm bell began to ring. 1 bell, then 2. The specific rapid pattern of the palace interior alert. Not fire, not exterior breach. Interior, cell check. Someone had found the cells empty and had started the sequence that would, within minutes, bring Morel's personal guard and then the palace guard, and then whatever fragile structure of authority Morel had spent the last 3 days carefully constructing down on top of this room. Cedric looked at the door. He looked at Selene. She looked back at him, and she felt, under the cold, under the 8 months of careful insulation, under everything she had built to keep herself functional in impossible conditions, The specific and almost unbearable weight of standing in a room with a person she had once trusted completely and needing right now, in the next 30 seconds, to decide whether to trust them again. Not with her heart. Her heart was not the instrument required. With her read. Her 8 months of watching the truth beneath performances. Her mother's teaching, balcon. The doors. Always the doors. The ones that were not in front of you. She looked at Cedric Valhart, and she asked herself, what is actually true about this man, underneath what he became? The bells got louder. Morkov and the Ravaryn holding, she said. Yes or no? He held her eyes. His jaw was set. His hand was still on the window frame, and his knuckles had gone white around it, and she could see in his face the specific struggle of a man who had governed by pride for so long that yielding felt like amputation. Then his hand released the frame. Yes, he said. She moved to the door. He moved with her. And in the corridor outside, Sovereign was already at the end of the passage with his hand on his sword hilt, and 3 more guards were coming up the stair, and somewhere below in the depths of the palace, Morel's voice was rising above the bells, sharp and controlled and carrying the particular authority of a woman who had managed this court for years and was not going to lose it quietly. Selene stopped at the threshold of Cedric's door. She looked at him beside her. She thought, there is no version of what comes next that does not cost something irreplaceable. She thought, the only thing worse than paying that cost is letting someone else decide what gets paid. Below them, the bells rang, and Morel's voice cut through the stone corridors of the palace that had been Selene's prison for 8 months, and the sound of boots on marble came from every direction at once, and Cedric put his hand briefly on Selene's arm. Not possessively, not with the authority he had spent 3 years wielding over her, but with the specific, worn weight of a man who understood, too late and not too late, what he was asking her to walk back into. She looked at the corridor ahead. She stepped through the door. The corridor filled fast. 6 guards came up the east stair and 4 more from the west passage, and they stopped when they saw Cedric standing at his own door, and the stopping had a particular quality. The specific halt of men who had been moving toward a target and arrived to find the target standing next to their king. They did not know what they were looking at yet. They knew it was not what they had been told to expect. Selene watched their faces. She watched them process the information. She watched the moment when the question moved through each of them. Whose authority am I actually operating under right now? That question was the crack in the wall she had been waiting for. Cedric spoke before anyone else could. His voice had the quality she remembered from the war councils. Not loud, not performing loudness, but carrying the specific weight of a man who had learned that the voice which expects to be obeyed does not raise itself. Stand down, he said. All of you. The guards looked at each other. Not insubordination, uncertainty. The uncertainty of men who had received instructions from one source and were now receiving contradictory instructions from a source that technically outranked the first. From the stairwell, Morel's voice cut upward. Do not stand down. The prisoner has escaped confinement and is a threat to the king's safety. She arrived at the top of the stair 30 seconds later, chorus behind her and 2 of her personal guard flanking her, and she stopped when she saw the corridor. Cedric at his door, Selene beside him, the palace guards frozen between 2 sets of instructions. She looked at Selene, she looked at Cedric. Her face did not change. That was the remarkable thing, the thing Selene would remember afterward. That even in this moment, even standing at the top of a stair having arrived too late to contain something she had been managing with great skill for 8 months, Morel's face remained composed. The practiced composure of a woman who had been performing control for so long that the performance and the thing itself had become indistinguishable. Almost. Your Majesty, Morel said. She addressed Cedric, but her eyes stayed on Selene. I apologize for the disturbance. This woman was confined for her own protection following the discovery of a conspiracy against the crown. She has deceived you into believing... Dovin, Cedric said. The composure broke. Not completely. A crack, a hairline fracture that passed across Morel's face in less than a second and was gone, but Selene saw it. And from the way Morel's eyes moved to her immediately afterward, Morel knew she had seen it. Dovin is a trade contact, Morel said. Her voice was still level. An intermediary for the northern. He's a claimant, Cedric said. Third-degree cousin to the Veldris throne. You've been writing to him for 4 years. He paused. How long have you known? It took Selene a moment to understand that the question was directed at her. 7 weeks, she said. I had fragments before that. The full picture took 7 weeks. Cedric looked at Morel. And in his face, in the way he stood at his own door in a plain unlaced shirt with his hair disordered and his authority stripped down to whatever was actually beneath it, Selene saw something she had not expected to see. Not rage. Rage would have been easier. What she saw was the specific devastation of a man confronting the cost of his own willful blindness. The understanding that he had not been deceived the way a clever man deceives a careless one. He had been deceived because he had needed to be, because he had chosen, somewhere on the long road home from a war that had taken everything soft out of him, to find someone who made the cruelty feel earned. He had known, at some level, that Morel was not what she performed. He had chosen her because of it, not despite it. Power recognized the architecture of power. He had simply not accounted for the direction it would eventually turn. Take her to the council chamber, he said, to the palace guards. Both of them. He looked at Chorus, at Morel's personal guard. You are dismissed to the barracks pending review. Morel said nothing. She looked at Selene one final time, and the look contained something Selene had never seen from her in 8 months. Not defeat, not quite, but the acknowledgement of a woman who had played every available card and found the hand insufficient. The look of someone who had understood the game at a very high level and had lost anyway. Then she turned and walked ahead of the palace guards down the stair, and the performance was back in place, and she held her shoulders correctly and her chin at the right angle. And Selene watched her go and thought, even now, even at the end of it, the performance does not stop. She understood, in that moment, something she had not understood clearly before, that for Morel, the performance was not a strategy applied over an authentic self. The performance was the self. Everything underneath it had been organized so long ago in service of survival that there was no longer a distinction between the woman and the mask. She had become exactly what she needed to become to get from wherever she had started to here. Selene had been doing the same thing for 8 months. The difference, she thought, following Cedric down the stair, was in what direction the transformation had been pointed. The council chamber was cold at this hour, the fire unlit, the long table catching the lamplight from the guards' torches in cold gleams. Cedric sat at the head of it. Selene took a chair 2 seats down, not beside him, not at the opposite end, but close enough to speak without performing distance. Morel was placed at the far end by the guards and left standing. What followed took 3 hours. Selene spoke for most of it. She had 8 months of stored observations, and she delivered them with the same methodical patience she had brought to everything. The grain tax failures in the eastern provinces, the disbanding of loyal regiments, the manufactured treason charges against servants who had known too much, the letters to Dovin and what she understood of their contents, the specific mechanisms by which Morel had isolated Cedric from every independent source of counsel and made herself the primary filter through which he received information about his own empire. Cedric listened. He asked 2 questions. The rest of the time he was very still, and the stillness had the quality of a man not managing his reactions, but actually receiving what he was hearing, which was different, and Selene noted the difference and did not comment on it. Morel spoke once. Everything she's describing, she said from the far end of the table, is the management of a court that was failing before I arrived. The regiments were loyal to old structures that no longer served the empire. The provincial lords were operating independent of the crown. The grain distribution was working, Selene said, until the central accounting was restructured under your oversight in the 2nd year. Morel looked at her. You can't prove the connection. Halverson can, Selene said. He's been trying to get an audience with the king about Eastern supply for 6 months. Ask him. The silence at the end of that was long and specific. Near dawn, Cedric called in Sovereign and gave 3 orders. The first restored Morkoff's regiment publicly, effective at the morning council session. The second halted the archive proceedings on the Ravaryn holdings. The third ordered a formal inquiry into the circumstances of Emmerich's imprisonment and the manufacturing of the treason charge. He delivered all three orders in the same flat voice, the voice of a man performing the functions of governance in the hours after something inside him had collapsed, because the function still needed performing regardless. Then he looked at Morel. "You'll be confined to your chambers pending the inquiry's completion," he said, "after which the findings will determine the formal charge." Morel looked at him for a long moment. She had been standing for 3 hours, and she had not asked to sit, had not shown the fatigue of it, had maintained the posture of a woman who was present in this room by choice rather than circumstance. Now, in the moment before she turned to go with the guards, she looked at Cedric with something that stripped away the last of the performance. Not malice, not defiance, but the bone-deep weariness of a woman who had been fighting since long before any of this began, and was tired in a way that no outcome in this room was going to touch. "I kept this empire from fracturing for 2 years, she said. "Whatever else I did, that is also true." She left. The door closed. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. Selene sat at the council table and felt the quiet settle into her, the way quiet settled into a person who had been braced against noise for so long that its absence created its own kind of pressure. Her hands were still. Her breathing was even. Outside, the capital was beginning to wake, the first sounds of the day's labor rising from the streets below the palace windows. The ordinary, unstoppable life of a city that had continued through everything. Cedric was looking at the table. She watched him, and she thought about what it cost a person to see themselves clearly. Not the partial clarity of guilt, not the selective reckoning of a man who acknowledged mistakes while protecting the story of himself. He needed to keep functioning. Real clarity, the kind that required you to look at the specific shape of your choices and their specific consequences without insisting on the context that made them understandable. She did not know if Cedric was capable of that. She suspected the answer was partial, which was the answer for most people, which did not make it sufficient, but made it the truth she had to work with. "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me," he said. His voice had the roughness of a man who had been awake all night and had arrived, through the hours of it, at something he had decided to say without dressing it. "Good," she said, "because I'm not in a position to answer that tonight." He looked at her. "When?" "I don't know." She held his gaze. "Forgiveness isn't a decision I can make for you on your timeline. It's something I'll either arrive at or I won't, and I have no way to tell you right now which it will be." She paused. "What I can tell you is that whatever I feel about what you did to me is separate from what needs to happen with this court. I'm not going to let the first one compromise the second." He was quiet for a moment. "What needs to happen with this court?" She looked at the empty chairs around the long table. The seats of lords who had spent years watching a woman pour wine and making calculations about which way the wind was blowing and coming, most of them, to the conclusion that silence was the safe choice. The seats of men who had voted with their posture and their careful dinner conversation to accept what was happening because the alternative required something from them they were not willing to give. She thought about Morkoff, who had sent a letter through the lining of an apron, about the unnamed young man who had opened a cell door in the dark, about Bessa, the kitchen girl who had a cousin in a garrison and had been carrying small things in small ways for 3 months, about Dara in the dye house in the lower city who was being brought in for questioning, who might already be in a room like the one Selene had spent 12 hours in. "First," she said, "we bring in Halverson, tonight before the council session. He needs to know what happened, and he needs time to understand what his options are before he has to perform a position in public." She looked at Cedric. "He's been waiting for someone to give him a signal. I'm telling you now that the signal has to come from you. Not from me. From you." "And Morkoff. Morkoff will hear about the regiment reinstatement by morning. He doesn't need to be told anything else. He'll understand what it means." Cedric nodded slowly. The nod of a man who was not agreeing because he was being managed, but because the logic was correct and he could see it. "And after that," he said, "what does the court look like after all of this?" Selene looked at the table. She looked at the chairs. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the cell on the stone floor with the strip of sky above her, in the years of careful planning before that, in the earliest days of her confinement, when she had still believed on some level that surviving this meant returning to what had been. She had thought about it until she understood, with the complete and irreversible understanding of a person who has been broken open by circumstances and forced to examine what is actually inside, that there was no going back to what had been. Not because it was gone, though it was, but because what had been was the thing that had produced this. The concentrated authority, the single point of power, the court that ran on fear of the man at the top of it and collapsed the moment that fear was transferred to the wrong person. She thought about her mother, the woman who had outlasted 3 kings not by fighting them, but by understanding that the door you needed was not always the door in front of you. She thought about the grain tax in the eastern provinces, and the disbanded regiments, and the manufacturing of treason charges against servants who knew too much. And she thought about the fact that all of those things had been possible because the structures that were supposed to prevent them had been organized around a single source of authority that could be captured. Different, she said. It looks different. She told him then. Not a complete blueprint. This was not the moment for blueprints. This was the moment for the first conversation, the one that determined whether the subsequent conversations were possible. She told him about the council she had been imagining in the cell on the stone floor, the council made not of men who owed their positions to proximity to a single ruler, but of people who had demonstrated competence in the domains they governed. Generals who had led armies, administrators who had managed provinces, people who understood the grain supply from the inside because they had worked it. She told him that Morkov needed a seat, that Halverson needed a genuine function rather than a ceremonial one, that the provincial lords who had been operating in fear of the capital needed to understand that their independent authority over their own regions was not a threat to the crown, but a structural necessity for a functioning empire. She told him that the burned palace, and she said this quietly, looking at the table, because it was the piece she had been least certain about bringing into a conversation she had not planned to have tonight, needed to stay burned. Whatever happened next could not be built in the same rooms where this had happened. The rooms carried the history of what they had produced. People needed to look at the ruin and understand what pride and concentrated power and the willingness to accept cruelty as the cost of stability had actually cost. Cedric listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that the window began to lighten, the first gray of a dawn that was arriving whether the people inside this room were ready for it or not. "You planned all of this," he said, "in a cell. I planned some of it in a cell. Most of it I planned while I was carrying your wine." He looked at her, something in his face that was not quite amusement and not quite pain, and was probably both at once. "My wine," he said, "and Morel's linens, and the guest chamber bedding, and the upper corridor mending." She held his gaze. "You gave me a great deal of time to think." He was quiet again. Then, "I'm going to ask you something." She waited. "Stay." He said it without performing the weight of it, without framing it as a request or a command or a gesture toward reconciliation. Just the word, flat and honest and carrying everything it carried. Not in the position I put you in, as yourself. As the person who built something in a cell in a laundry room that I couldn't build in a council chamber. He held her eyes. "I'm asking you to stay and help me take apart the thing I made and build something better." Selene looked at him. She thought about her mother, who had married a man who turned out to be worth the years she gave him. She thought about Emmerich, riding south in the dark toward the Ravaryn lowlands with the mineral rights documentation burning in his mind. She thought about Dara in a dye house that smelled of indigo and cedar, and the particular industry of a woman who had been wrongfully dismissed and had not stopped working. She thought about herself. 8 months of cold corridors and silver jugs, and the practiced invisibility of a woman who had decided that what they could take from her was not the same as what she was. She thought about the things she had discovered in those 8 months. Not strategy, not patience, though she had needed both. The thing underneath those, the understanding that the person she had been before, the queen who poured wine for lords in the rose marble halls and accepted the admiration of a court as confirmation of her worth, had not known what she was made of. You did not know what you were made of until the conditions that had been confirming it were taken away. Until you were standing in a laundry room with a message to carry and no guarantee that any of it would matter, and you carried it anyway because the alternative was not the safety of doing nothing, but the slow erasure of becoming nothing. She had not survived 8 months of this and come out the other side the same woman who had entered it. That woman would have said yes to him tonight, would have felt the pull of restoration, of reclaiming the position that had been taken, of the satisfaction of returning to a place of recognized authority with the added confirmation that she had been right all along. This woman, the one who had been built in the space between the wine jug and the stone floor, looked at Cedric Veilhart and understood that what he was asking for was not a restoration. He was asking her to build something new in the ruins of what had failed. He was asking her to do that with him, which required a level of continued trust she had not yet determined she could give. But she also understood something else. The thing she had been working toward was not personal. The council she had imagined, the structural changes, the provincial authorities, the people who needed someone to give them a signal and then step back and let them act. None of that required her to have resolved what she felt about the man sitting across from her. It required her to be the person she had become, which she already was. "Not as my husband," she said. "That's a separate conversation for a different day, and I'm not making any promises about where it goes." She held his gaze. "But as the person who helped you understand what was happening to this empire, yes, I'll stay." He nodded. He did not press the other thing, which was either discipline or wisdom, and she chose, for now, to read it as both. The council session that morning was the longest in the Empire's recent memory. Halverson arrived at the pre-session meeting, still carrying the wariness of a man who had spent 8 months calibrating his political survival to a wind that had been blowing in Morel's direction. He sat down across from Selene and Cedric, and he looked at them both and he said, "Tell me what you need me to do." Morkov received the reinstatement order at the 6th morning bell. He appeared at the palace 2 hours later with the bearing of a man who had been waiting at attention for orders that had not come for a very long time and had not let the waiting make him soft. He looked at Selene when he entered the council chamber and he said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "You stayed in the city." "I told you I was still here," she said. He nodded, once, and took his seat at the table. The session itself was 3 hours of the kind of conversation that institutions had when they were deciding all at once what they were going to be. Loud in places. Uncomfortable in the way that necessary things were uncomfortable, not with the manufactured drama of a court performance, but with the specific discomfort of people who had been operating inside a failing system, trying to figure out how much of their own behavior inside that system they had to account for. Halverson and Vastin and 2 other Eastern lords talked about the grain supply with the unguarded directness of men who had been trying to have this conversation through official channels for years and had been prevented at every turn. Morkov talked about the army, not its size, but its character, the difference between a fighting force built on loyalty to an office and a fighting force built on fear of the person currently occupying it. 2 younger lords who had been silent through the worst of it said almost nothing but were present and visibly listening, which was its own kind of beginning. Cedric listened more than he spoke. That too was different. Selene watched it without commenting on it, because commenting on the correct behavior of a person learning to do something differently was a way of making the behavior about the observer rather than the person doing it, and she was not interested in that. She spoke when she had something to add and was quiet when she did not. And when the session ended, she sat at the long table for a few minutes after the others had filed out, and she looked at the empty chairs, and she thought about what it had taken to fill them with honest voices instead of careful ones. She thought about Morel, in her chambers under guard, waiting for the inquiry's conclusion. The inquiry took 4 days. The Doven letters were produced by a contact in the Northern Territories who had been sitting on them for 2 years, waiting for the moment when producing them would not result in immediate destruction. Morel did not contest their authenticity. She sat through the formal proceedings with the composed stillness of a woman who had done the calculation and understood that the only dignity available to her now was the refusal to perform desperation. The sentence was exile, not execution. Selene had argued against execution, quietly, in the conversation with Cedric 2 days before the inquiry concluded. Not out of mercy for Morel specifically, but because the precedent of executing a woman for scheming in a court that had been built on schemes was a precedent that cut in directions no one could fully predict. Exile was complete. Exile was irrevocable in its own way. Exile meant that the empire moved forward without carrying the cost of what it had done to get here in the name of justice. Morel left the capital on a gray morning in the early weeks of the cold season. Selene was not present for her departure, which was a choice. She learned about it afterward from Chorus, who had been permitted to accompany her mistress into exile and had chosen to do so, which Selene noted and did not judge. Loyalty took the shapes available to it. She was in the Eastern District that morning, riding with Halverson and two of his administrators, looking at the grain distribution routes that had broken down under the restructuring and needed to be rebuilt from the outside in rather than the inside out. It was cold, and the roads were rutted from the first autumn rains, and her horse was not the quality of the horses she had ridden as queen, but the animal was steady and willing, which was what the work required. Emmerich sent a letter from the Ravaryn lowlands. It was long and slightly chaotic, written in the way he wrote when he had too much to say and not enough confidence in what order to say it, and it contained toward the end a sentence she read 3 times before she folded the letter away. He wrote, "I don't know how you did it. I was in that place for 6 weeks and I came out of it different. You were in that palace for 8 months. I want to know who you are now. Come home when you can and tell me." She would go home. Not yet, but soon. The Highland Keep in the winter, the long table where their mother would already be seated when they arrived, the fire that burned in the great hall regardless of the weather outside because their mother maintained that the only reliable warmth was the kind you controlled yourself. She thought about going home. She let herself feel it, not sentimentality, not the performed softness of a person decorating a resolution, but the real thing, the plain animal warmth of imagining a place where no one needed anything from her except her actual presence. She held it for a moment. Then she put it away, in the place where she kept the things worth coming back to, and she turned her horse back toward the capital. The burned palace was visible from the eastern road on clear days. The fire had started in the kitchens during the confusion of that night. Not arson, which the history books would eventually correct, though the correction arrived late, and the story of Selene setting fire to her own prison had already settled into the city's understanding of what had happened in a way that served something true, even if it was not literally accurate. The fire had been an accident of overturned lamps, in the chaos of the alarm bells, and the guard confusion, and Morel's people trying to destroy documents in a kitchen fireplace that was not designed for the volume of paper they were feeding it. What mattered was what remained. The ruin stood at the center of the capital like a question that had not yet been answered about what the empire was going to choose to become. Some lords had argued for immediate rebuilding. Selene had argued for waiting, and had given the argument enough force that the question was still open. She thought the ruin needed to stand through at least one winter, long enough for the people of the capital to walk past it in the cold and feel it, not as a monument, not as a symbol that had been officially designated, but as the presence of a consequence, the material evidence that things had happened here and that the people who had let them happen had to live with the shape of what they had let happen until they were ready to choose something different. Real change, she had come to understand, was not the announcement of new intentions. It was not the installation of new people in old structures. It was slower and more unglamorous than that, the daily work of rebuilding the thing that had been broken at the level where it had actually broken, which was almost always deeper than the level at which it had failed visibly. It was Halverson asking hard questions in council sessions because someone had made it safe to ask them. It was Morkoff's reinstated regiment running drills that were about actual military preparedness rather than the performance of loyalty. It was a kitchen girl named Bessa who had been formally cleared of any involvement in subversive activity and was still working in the palace kitchens, still carrying small things in small ways, except now the small things were parts of the normal operations of an institution trying to function honestly. It was Selene herself, on a cold morning on a rutted road with a steady horse under her, doing the work that needed doing without requiring that anyone confirm it was the right kind of work for someone of her standing. She had stopped needing that. Somewhere in the 8 months of silver jugs and stone floors, she had set down the question of whether the world recognized what she was worth, and she had not picked it up again. Not because the question was unimportant, but because she had found, in the setting down of it, that the work itself was the answer. You did not become the person you were by having that person confirmed from outside. You became her by making the choices that person made, over and over, in the specific and unglamorous conditions that were actually available to you. That was what her mother had always been trying to tell her, not where the doors were. How to recognize the kind of person who could walk through them without needing to be told they were worthy of opening. The capital emerged from the winter haze as she crested the last rise on the eastern road. The burned palace was visible, dark against the gray sky, its ruined walls holding their shape against the cold. Around it, the city went on being a city. Smoke from 10,000 fires, the sound of work and argument and ordinary living, the enormous, indifferent continuity of people who needed the day's bread regardless of what was happening in the halls above them. Selene looked at the ruin. She thought, that is what the old thing cost. That is what it looks like when the structure cannot hold the weight of what it was built to justify. She thought, what comes next will be built differently, or it will come down too. She thought, I am the person who knows the difference, and I am still here. She rode back into the capital with her back straight and her hands steady, and the cold wind off the northern road in her face, and she did not look like a queen restored. She did not look like a woman who had won. She looked like what she was, someone who had gone all the way to the bottom of what a person could endure and had found, at the bottom of it, not defeat, but ground. Solid, unglamorous, actual ground, the kind you could build on, the kind that did not require anyone else's permission to stand on. She rode through the city gate, and the guard on duty recognized her and straightened, and she nodded to him and kept riding, and the city closed around her the way cities did, indifferent and necessary and fully, stubbornly alive. And the day's work was waiting, and she went to meet it.